Good morning. I'm Greg Brown. I'm Executive Director of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today. Today we'll be discussing a number of policy implications of the 2020 election, and with a particular eye toward U.S. business and the economy, trade and foreign relations, and of course the ongoing COVID-19 recovery efforts. We'll spend the back half of today's session fielding your questions, so I want to welcome you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure that we'll get quite a few based on the topics today and attendance that we're expecting, so we may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly do our best. So to get things started, I want to just provide a very high-level view of our session before we dive into the details. You know, there are so many issues in play currently with the economy, with business, with policy, and a tremendous level of uncertainty around many of them. Just a couple, of course, first and foremost, probably the pandemic is still having a tremendous impact on the business and continuing to rage, shall we say. It's been getting worse the last month or so. And I think one of the big concerns is that it's going to be having a negative impact on the economy again, whereas we'd seen some economic recovery for the last 3 or 4 months. We've seen some recent data that suggests there may be a negative impact on employment, especially in growth in the coming months. And then at the same time, we've seen the stock market at record highs, a rally that's really becoming broader. There's more sectors participating. So, unless the market is crazy, which is always an alternative hypothesis, this is a vote of confidence for the economic future. So hopefully today we're going to be able to make some sense of all that's happening right now with the change in administration and uncertainty over Congress, and especially the role of policy and what will happen over the next several months. So let me introduce our panel of experts today. We're joined by Christian Lundblad, who is the Levin Distinguished Professor of Finance at Kenan-Flagler Business School, and also the Director of Research at the Kenan Institute. Tom Quaadman is a Senior Advisor and Senior Executive Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Executive Vice President for the Chamber's Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness. And Kenan Institute Senior Fellow Mary Moore Hamrick. She's also CEO of Political Quotient Advisors and former Chief Public Policy Officer for Grant Thornton. So with that, we're going to start out with some opening remarks from each of our panelists, and I'm going to turn things over to you, Mary Moore, for our first discussion.
Yes, thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here today. I just want to set the table a little bit. The outcome of our 2020 election was clearly a referendum on President Trump, as opposed to the election of Joe Biden based on voters for Joe Biden. Most of them said they voted against President Trump. So we had that against a record voter turnout of over 150 million voters compared to over 137 million 4 years ago. And what did we learn? We really learned that our voters are much more complex than gender, ethnicity, or other demographics may say. There's similarities, but it's really a mistake to assume that we have a clear direction from either the vote or from our various voters. Latino voters in Miami-Dade County voted for President Trump, whereas you saw Phoenix, Maricopa County went for Vice President Joe Biden. Pollsters couldn't figure out the shy Trump voter, couldn't get a handle on those. And then you saw a very excellent piece in yesterday's Wall Street Journal by Rahm Emanuel talking about the electorate being more complex and less partisan than appreciated. That Florida approved Donald Trump as their candidate, but they voted in a $15 an hour minimum wage on their ballot initiative. So what you're seeing is a divided, complex country who sent back to Congress a more divided, not only a divided country, but a closely governing Congress, in that the House lost 10 seats. The Democrats lost 10 seats. We have Speaker Pelosi, but she is going to have to marshal and govern and shepherd her party between the more moderate side that may be more closely aligned with Joe Biden, but he also has tendencies of the more progressive side, the more liberal side. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that from Tom Quaadman later, but she's got to balance those tensions as she tries to reach a majority vote on any issue that comes before the House. And certainly when we get to the Senate, we don't know the outcome or who will be leading the Senate. We have 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats. It's going to all come down to Georgia and whether we have a 50-50 split with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, or if Senator McConnell will again be the majority leader. That will all determine the level of the policy initiatives, the extent to which things can get passed, what direction and how they'll go. We'll have a little bit more conversation about that later. I thought Peggy Noonan was very prescient in her column in October 24, saying that if Joe Biden was lucky, he would win the House, hold the House, win the presidency, and lose the Senate because it would give him an excuse for moderation. She went on to say that the Democrats win all three. It'll be a runaway train fueled by pent-up progressive demand. So it just underscores the fact that who's running the Senate will determine what sort of policies President Biden can put into place. President Biden was elected on his campaign platform of being a unifier, of bringing the country back together again, of saying that he could do a better job in COVID management and in healthcare. And he also campaigned on social justice reform, as well as tax increases to pay for climate change and infrastructure. So there are a lot of things that he would like to do. And I actually think because Congress is so close that we have a very unique opportunity for collaboration. And I think that if the rank and file members you're seeing in Congress now, there is a lot of pent-up frustration of wanting to get things done. The chamber said as recently as yesterday that there is that appetite that only COVID passed this year. That was the one key thing, a monumental effort, and that there is a desire to get things done. And for starters, President Biden is going to be approved by the Senate. 1,200 of his incoming nominations are going to have to be Senate confirmed. And you've got a situation where you've got two political pros. You've got Joe Biden, who comes out of the Senate, and you've got Senator McConnell, who he served with. They worked together when Joe Biden was vice president and Mitch McConnell was leading the Senate on coming up with a continuing resolution with a deal to keep the government running. And I'm very hopeful that they can come back together again and use those back channel relationships to get some things done. I think the areas that are ripe for compromise are a COVID relief package that's been called for in the area of the economy and back to work. Biden's slogan, Made in America, is very similar to what Republicans heard from Donald Trump. I think that while Republicans might not be for a Green New Deal, they all like clean air and water. So I think that there's some room for compromise in that area. Certainly on infrastructure, many were disappointed that we didn't see more progress on an infrastructure package. It makes sense to me that President Biden could come out with ways to bring broadband to disadvantaged opportunities as part of a COVID relief package. And that would build on the opportunity zones that Republican Senator Tim Scott proposed as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In the civil justice reform area, while the focus has been on policing reform, I think the business community should look more towards the business roundtables, stakeholder value conversations in August of 19. And as recently as yesterday, NASDAQ announced that they are supportive of having a diversity on boards on the companies listed on their exchanges, where boards would have at least gender diversity in the form of one woman, and in sexual orientation as well. And then a topic that I know that Tom Quaadman has spoken brilliantly about and many times on is ESG. I think that there's an increased momentum to see forward movement in this area and pressure on C-suites and the boards in that area. So to wrap up, I think the party that figures out how to get things done, how to fix these problems, to hit some singles and exercise those muscles of governing, passing small bills and building on them, building compromise, learning for the middle to fight the battle with the purist and who sometimes make the perfect the enemy of the good. I think there really is an opportunity for us to see some positive movement and to actually see government, because either a lot of things are going to get done or nothing is going to get done. And my fingers are crossed and I'm on the optimistic side. So with that, let me turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Tom Quaadman, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mary Moore. And Greg and Christian, appreciate being with you today as well. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. Let me pick up where Mary Moore left off and about the elections. And let me also talk a little bit about some of the policy implications from there as well. So Mary Moore is right that Georgia provides a pivot for how we are going to govern. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. The election showed that the American people voted for a divided government. They voted for a Democratic president, Joe Biden. The Republicans made significant gains in the House of Representatives. In fact, the margins in the House of Representatives are the closest they've been since the end of World War I. And the election isn't over. And I'm not talking about any presidential recounts. That is over. But Georgia, where we have the two runoffs. So the reason why I say that is a pivot is that if the Democrats pick up 2 seats, we will probably see more of a progressive style form of government. If Democrats take control of the Senate, there will be a big push to do away with the filibuster. So with the current filibuster rules, you really need 60 votes in the Senate in order to move legislation on the Senate floor. If you get rid of the filibuster, it's simply a majority vote. That has very significant implications because the filibuster actually allows legislation to cool. There was the old saying that legislation is a little bit like a cup of tea. House of Representatives, it's hot, it's boiling, it's steaming. But you put the tea in the saucer, and that's what the Senate is. Allows it to cool, allows things to develop from there. And one of the reasons why I would say that you're going to see some of those progressive elements in terms of governing come up if there is Democratic control of the Senate is that Chuck Schumer will be the Senate Majority Leader, and Chuck Schumer is very worried about a primary in 2022 from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And AOC, as she's commonly referred to, has had a very successful run of of Democratic primaries this past year, and actually solidified her position in New York State politics by taking over and solidifying the ballot position of the Working Families Party, which is a union-backed party in New York. However, if the Republicans take the 2 Senate seats, then I agree with Mary Moore. You're probably going to see more centrist government. One, Mitch McConnell is more of an institutionalist, where he is much more willing to abide by the rules of the Senate. And one of those rules generally is if the president submits somebody for a nomination, the president is entitled to that person serving in his cabinet unless there's some major reason why that would not be the case. Additionally, the American people do want to have things done. So there will be a desire to move forward on certain things. Infrastructure could be a possibility, and I'm going to get into some other specifics. But there will be more of a desire to spell out an agenda. May not be as ambitious as progressives would like, may not necessarily be in the direction that conservative Republicans would like to go, but we are going to see some areas where there's going to be more of a possibility of getting things done. You're actually seeing already where you've seen centrist Republicans and Democrats coming together, such as Susan Collins and Joe Manchin, where you now have a gang of 7 that are probably going to sway how things go in either direction. That gang of 7 will be influential, whether or not there's going to be a filibuster rule in place or not. So it'll be very interesting to see how that starts to impact things like immigration reform, infrastructure, different things like that. But let me get into a few policy areas that I think are most top of mind for the business community. Let's say short term, medium term, and longer term. So for the short term is pandemic relief. When the CARES Act passed and was signed into law last March, the prevailing thinking around the CARES Act was that, well, we have to sort of get through a 60, 75-day period at worst, get to the other side, and we need the CARES Act to bridge the economy for that short period of time. I remember one point in April where I was involved in a meeting on a few things, and something came over, and Governor Northam had issued an announcement in Virginia where he said, well, we're going to have a shutdown through June. And everybody's looking at each other, well, really through June? Well, here we are in December, and we're going through the third wave of the coronavirus. So even though there's a lot of good news about vaccines, and I would say we're going to be in a much different situation 8 months from now than where we are today, we're still going to have to get through this winter. I saw some numbers coming out of the New York and New Jersey area yesterday, where 28% of small businesses in New York and New Jersey have gone out of business. That is a number that is consistent with other data that we've seen from around the rest of the country. We're going to see certain industries that are going to be in a downturn for a much longer period of time than other sectors of the economy. So, for instance, the travel and tourism industry, the large events industries are going to be in a much more severe recession for longer than the rest of the economy. But the reason why I also cited those small business numbers is that one area I would really suggest that people pay attention to is commercial real estate. As businesses go out of business, as retail shops are not getting the foot traffic that they once had, we're going to see commercial real estate come under a lot of pressure, which it has already been. There have been different means for forbearance, but forbearance can only last for so long. If the commercial real estate industry starts to come under severe stress, that stress will be felt throughout the financial services sector, as we have many financial instruments linked to commercial real estate that have also been securitized. So I would say that is something that is important to keep an eye on. But we're going to also see in Washington continued efforts and increased debate about a form of pandemic relief. There have been efforts to try and get this done before January 20th. There have been signals that have been sent as well that we may want to wait until after the Georgia runoffs to see what the makeup of the Senate will be, and then what the art of the possible is going to be. Speaker Pelosi had earlier this year was playing for time, seeking to have a much larger package. Conservative Republicans were very worried about overspending, but we're beginning to see where both sides are gravitating more towards the middle. So more to be seen there, but that is going to be very critical for how we get through the economic downturn this winter. Environmental social governance issues, which Mary Moore had mentioned. we will see, I think, a Biden SEC move forward with some form of mandated SEC disclosures around ESG. Now, this has been developing in the United States through a market-driven approach. In Europe, it's been much different. They are actually trying to define ESG and then drive it down through their regulation of their asset managers. The EU has been very specific about wanting to create a global standard. We'll have to actually see how that, if that's possible, as the US and the UK actually control a significant portion of the asset management industry. But I do think that the Clayton SEC this past summer, with their human capital disclosure, where they came up with finalized the rulemaking on human capital disclosure, took a very principles-based approach, which means that ESG under that framework would be designed on a company-by-company and an industry basis. One other thing I would just mention about ESG, and I'm sure we can get into it further, while there are global developments around ESG, the nomenclature is used, it actually means different things, even though the language is similar. So by that, I mean, when you talk about ESG in Europe, it's about climate change. It's not about social issues. When you talk about ESG in the United States, it is, climate change is an obvious issue, but it's much more socially focused. I think the NASDAQ developments yesterday demonstrate that, and corporate board diversity has been a hot topic on that. So we're going to have to see which approach works. And the other issue is companies use ESG communications to talk to their employee base, to talk to consumers, to talk to vendors, in addition to talking to investors. And the questions become, at what point do we have certain information go into securities disclosures, and how is it that we actually reconcile that with other forms of communication? Then lastly, let me talk about China. As much as we have polarized government and a polarized electorate, the one thing that unites Democrats and Republicans in Washington around the country is China. We're going actually today, the House will pass a bill on China delistings. That had passed the Senate with 98 votes. That will pass the House probably unanimously. There might be a few exceptions. The China-U.S. economic relationship is one that is important to the global economy. There is going to be some form of decoupling that will go on. There have been concerns raised by both Democrats and Republicans about the reliance of the U.S. supply chains on China. But the Biden administration is going to take a much different approach. They may be as tough on China as a Trump administration was, but look for the Biden administration to engage with the European Union, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan, South Korea, to form an international coalition to act as a bulwark against Chinese expansionism. We saw the Trump administration walk away from the TPP, but we may see the Biden administration use free trade agreements as they had traditionally been used in the post-World War U.S. economy, not only for trade relationships, but as much for security relationships. So we'll have to see if the TPP gets revived or if we're going to see other vehicles there. So a lot to talk about, and let me pass it on to my colleagues and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you. So thanks, Tom, and I'll give you some thoughts from my perspective. So I'm going to structure them along three dimensions. I'll talk a little bit about COVID relief, a bit about Janet Yellen as a choice for the Treasury Secretary, and then I'll conclude on trade. And in particular, so it's been articulated already the extent to which, the near-term economic story is pretty dire, right? So the political outcome has huge implications, I would say, philosophically, for things like healthcare and taxation, optimal taxation, regulatory frameworks, trade, all of that. And that's kind of beyond the here and now. Right now, we have COVID cases exploding, as we said, and sort of the epidemiologist fear of a second wave or third wave or whatever we want to call this has obviously materialized. I do want to mention one thing that Greg said at the outset, which is kind of the seemingly odd disconnect that presents with respect to financial markets. So financial markets are running rather hot. And so you could kind of ask yourself, like, what policies or developments are they kind of seeing through, beyond the challenges right now? So clearly, vaccine development is obviously there. Maybe some optimism about a divided government, in contrast to what others have said, that it's going to be hard to get some of the more, aggressive things done from the perspective of the progressive side. And then also maybe an improved aspect for global relations and a recovery of trade, reduced tariffs, perhaps. I think that's possible, and I want to come back to a couple of those. But clearly, the fingerprints of the Federal Reserve are everywhere here, and so that's not really going away. The Fed has signaled that they're going to keep their policy rate in place, perhaps well into 2023. And so I would argue financial markets are overvalued as a consequence to that, and that just stands sort of in sharp contrast to where the real economy is, which is in pretty serious danger, right? I mean, here the near term demands desperately some additional support. I mean, so why? We've heard about some of this already. So small business closures that was mentioned, and new restrictions to the extent that they're going to manifest or be required, they're going to hit here very, very hard. Some of the PPP loans and other support for that particular space has kind of rolled off now. Generally speaking, non-essential business activity has remained constrained. It's certainly plateaued, since some improvement earlier in the year, and that has the risk of even getting somewhat worse. So our measure on our data dashboard at the Kenan Institute of consumer consternation, which is sort of designed to represent the extent to which we struggle to, or maybe restricted from, engaging in non-essential economic activity, that started to tick back up as problematic. I think something else that hasn't been mentioned thus far is the state of state and local governments, right, which is pretty dire. And I think there's a significant risk of furloughs here, if not outright layoffs. And where does that hit hardest? Non-essential, essential workers, and particularly educators. And then ultimately also some of the other augmented benefits that we've seen from the CARES Act and other efforts have or are going to be rolling off, and that's hitting with additional socioeconomic adversity. We also measure that on our data dashboard. Concerns about anxiety and depression and other sort of non-pecuniary outcomes associated with all this. And a vaccine development, as important as it's going to be for the medium run, it just doesn't help here until maybe the middle part of next year, perhaps at best. So one of the really critical challenges for the incoming administration is to sort of tackle this. I mean, part of it will be about vaccine logistics. That's a really important thing that is going to interplay with the economic outcome, a strategy for prioritization, and ultimately, a health message about take-up. But ultimately, it's going to be about additional stimulus that's simply required. We have to find a way to shepherd Americans through, and I'm hopeful that rekindling that I think you're seeing even over the last several days might actually bear fruit. But the reality is, we do have a divided government and some degree of contention, and so I'm a bit worried that may get pushed back until after January 20th, in which case it doesn't really impact the real economy, for several months beyond that. Additionally, I think an important economic policy is actually a healthcare policy related to attending to hospital capacity, attending to important protective equipment and such. And so, all of this is challenging. I mean, the real economy is in pretty rough shape. I think we have a legitimate fear, perhaps of a W-shaped, economic realization where we have a kind of second dip. I hope that's not the case, but one thing that we have often been worried about now for months is what we call scarring. So that's the extent to which the longer this has kind of borne out, the more you have permanent closures, and the more you have a disconnecting of laborers from their places of employment, and that becomes more long-term. Then it's not easy to sort of put Humpty Dumpty back together in that kind of setting, and that's where sort of very targeted and very aggressive policy is pretty important. And so that's just reiterating the things I think we've seen already. Moving to the medium run, I think there's much more hopeful signs. I think the medical breakthroughs are frankly astounding. And the person who's been now tasked, or will be subject to confirmation, is Janet Yellen. And I think that's a shrewd pick. I really do. I think it is for economic reasons, and I also think it is for political reasons. For political reasons, I think everyone can see something in her that resonates, wherever they sit from the political spectrum, and she's more likely probably to get through. That may not have been the first choice of in the more progressive side of the Democratic Party, but I think she's actually likely to be successful in confirmation. In terms of the economic side, she's very credible. She has sort of a long-standing set of experiences, both in the academy as a preeminent researcher, and also obviously as a former Fed governor, as a chairwoman, and in the White House as well. And so I think all of that makes the choice shrewd, and she is most interestingly an expert in labor markets. That's where she sort of comes from that perspective. And so as we struggle with the consequences of this scarring that I mentioned, which is a disproportionate amount of labor is sort of semi-permanently disconnected from their places of employment, I'm very happy to have her stewardship in this role. Maybe a slightly more nuanced take on that. I think she'll also work well with the Fed, and so that's because of her, obviously her earlier position. That may be more effective than the outgoing administration. We saw kind of a hiccup very recently between the Treasury, Department and the Fed, and I think more generally, there have been some danger of politicization of the way in which the president has interfaced with what he viewed as optimal Fed policy, which has generally not been the case in the past. That's sort of been a red line that one didn't cross, and so I think that's that's a good thing to be a constructive partner, but not dictating what should be a relatively technocratic policy. Finally, one point of skepticism, though, that if one were to have it, is despite the fact she did steward the removal of the zero lower bound, so she started to see interest rates coming off the lower bound, with some controversy, frankly. I think she's generally viewed as one of the more dovish central bankers, certainly going into that position. And so, to the extent that, anyone is worried about quantitative easing and anyone's worried about the level of indebtedness, the reality is quantitative easing is not going to fix all the things we've been talking about. And financial markets are, I believe, already overvalued. And so there's some financial vulnerabilities that are there. And we've got, on top of that, a mountain of debt that we've now accumulated, and we'll probably have to continue to pile on as a result of the needed stimulus. And so how are we going to find our way through that? And so we're going to need some very frank conversation. I think that's going to be one of the challenges for all political leaders in the medium run, and certainly in the long run, is to tackle fiscal responsibility. Right? That hasn't gone away. Finally, on trade, let me talk about that for a moment, and then we can open up to questions. So actually, I would say this is not really about COVID. I think the skepticism about trade has been brewing really since the financial crisis. I think that was a watershed moment. It was the shock of the moment that kind of doubted a political and order, sort of the Washington consensus that was that had been in place for some time going forward. That, coupled with the relatively low growth that we witnessed here in the United States and around the world, I think just sort of brought a lot of skepticism and a lot of discontent that ultimately, sort of bore fruit in the Brexit outcome. I think it did also in the Trump election and perhaps even the move on the other side in Bernie Sanders. So as different as those two candidates were in 2016 and continue to be going forward, they shared a representation of a constituency that had grown increasingly uncertain about trade. Trade was sort of deemed the culprit. My view on this is that that trade is complex, and some of that was a misdiagnosis. But the reality is, sentiment has changed, and so there's really no going back to pre-2008, 2009, in my view. And so I think going forward, then, for any political leader, and I think Joe Biden is now tasked with that, and his team, what are the goals that we want to hit? I mean, I think my view would be to figure out how to harness the benefits of globalization, the unambiguous benefits of globalization, frankly, for economic activity and even poverty reduction, frankly, but yet to make them more inclusive. And this requires a strategy. And the reality is tariffs and a sequence of tariffs and a lot of jawboning, those are tactics. That's not a strategy, right? And so, given that, then where does that leave us? And what are the policy challenges that I think we have going forward? Number one, I think a kind of return to a pre-2008, a pre-Trump perhaps globalized era is very unlikely, despite what the world might have looked like before all of this. I think we do have the scope to come to some less contentious arrangement with our traditional allies and partners. That was mentioned to Tom already. I think that's considerably more likely, but the game has changed, right? So the view of trade amongst many of those partners also has reflected a different view of their constituencies in some sense. I do think a full deglobalization is quite unlikely. But if I were thinking about this as a risk manager, I wouldn't view that as zero probability. And so risk management is not what you think it's going to happen. It's what do I do if, and you ought to be wargaming a pretty unusual outcome. And then finally, I'll leave it on this, which is the China-US relationship is forever altered. I think that there's no putting the cat back in the bag on that one, so to speak. And so that's going to be the single greatest geopolitical challenge, I think, of this administration and its successors. And I think we have to be very careful because we want to try to find ways to encourage feverish economic competition in lieu of other more treacherous forms of competition. And if we focus too heavily on trying to engineer a kind of economic decoupling, that only leaves both of our nations worse off. So I'll leave it there and then pass it along to Greg for a Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Tom and Mary Moore. So I want to start off with follow up on something that both Mary Moore and Tom touched on, and it's something Christian and I have been discussing recently as well. And it's this issue of ESG. So I mean, ESG might sort of seem like a niche issue, but when you think about what's really at stake here for businesses, we're talking about environmental policy, we're talking about sort of social policy, how companies are perceived in the marketplace, how they're perceived by their employees, and of course governance. And again, maybe the biggest question is around the role of the corporation and the potential changing role of the corporation, and movement, in the words of business themselves, towards stakeholder capitalism and away from shareholder capitalism. But my question, I think, maybe especially curious what Mary Moore and Tom think about this, is this companies just trying to get in front of policy movements and maybe trying to diffuse things, or is this a genuine attempt by businesses to change how they operate? What's kind of the truth behind this ESG and stakeholder capitalism movement that we've seen pick up speed the last couple of years in the U.S.?
I could take the first crack. I think there are a few things that are driving that movement in the United States. First off, materiality always shifts, right? What was material for a company in 1950 is different than what it is today, and it'll be different again in 2050. So materiality shifts, and what investors view as being a critical piece of information for them to make their investment decisions is going to change with time. So I think that's number one. Number two, there are increased pressures both within the employee base of a company, which is much more vocal than it's ever been, and even with consumers, for companies to take positions on different issues, which companies had always been reluctant to do in the past. The third is that there's been this perception, at least amongst some, where that Washington is broken and that maybe public companies need to sort of lean in on some issues. So a couple of thoughts there. One is the day after the BRT stakeholder capitalism statement came out last year, I was in an all-day meeting. I was sitting next to a former CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And he and I had known each other for a while, and we were actually talking about this. And he had seen an earlier version of the BRT statement, and he had a very interesting thing to say where he goes, at heart, I'm a Milton Friedman guy, but he goes, in reality, our company's always done these things, right? And he actually used an example where he had an issue where all their computer programmers were educated in COBOL, right? That was no longer right. That was no longer the language that they needed. So their computer programmers were in their 50s. So he had a decision to either retrain them or fire them all and hire, programmers in their 20s, right? He made a decision that they were going to retrain their programmers. Now he said, did it cost more money? Yeah. He goes, did we get any more, benefit out of it? Maybe not. If it was a pure bottom line decision, you could have gone with the cheaper programmers. But he goes, they felt it was important for their loyalty to their employees to do what they did. The last point I'll just raise is, and I think governance has always been an issue. I think environment, it depends on the company or the industry. Climate is an issue for different companies or different industries. I don't think that is necessarily new. What is new, and I think where we have to be a little careful, is social. And I actually had a conversation with an influential group in the ESG space about 3 years ago on this. And I said to them, look, a lot of the issues that get talked about in the ESG space tend to be left of center. And, everybody around the room was shaking their heads. I said, well, now, if we want to be true to ourselves, everybody needs to be comfortable if the right of center starts to raise those issues, and by the way that they are. And everybody starts to look at each other like, well, we hadn't really thought of it in that way. So if you take a look at thought of diversity shareholder proposals at Google, if you take a look at shareholder proposals at Apple on charitable donations, those are coming from conservatives. So the paradox we need to solve with ESG is, what is material for the shareholder? What is important to the bottom line of the long-term health of a company? What is important for investor return? And what we can't do is just turn boards into debating societies.
No, that's very interesting. And Mary Moore, what's your take on this?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think that the two black swan events being actually three: COVID, our economic pandemic that the pandemic caused, our economic reversal, and the events surrounding George Floyd. I mean, that changed our work environment because while stakeholder account, we were talking about stakeholder situations, but it brought home the fact of how important our employees are, because we now all of a sudden, how can companies operate with everybody at home? How can companies operate with mothers who are having to school their kids and work at the same time? How are you going to handle the suppliers because you can't get what you need because it's coming in from China and there's tariffs? I mean, I think that the spotlight was put on that. The situation with George Floyd brought to head, where are we with diversity and what does that mean? And so I think that you could not have predicted. ESG was in the pipeline. I've heard Tom speak on it. I did at 2 events to NACD meetings speaking on this topic before we got into 2020. And you certainly also had the pressure from Elizabeth Warren's Corporate Accountability Act, and most people didn't pay much attention to it. I spoke about it at a Stanford NACD chapter in October of 19, and they said, oh, that'll never happen. And I said, no, you really need to take this seriously. She was leading in the Democratic primary at that time. I think that the spotlight has been shown on it, and that to just move forward, we got to figure out, how do we deal with employees? How do we deal with suppliers? And the actions have resulted. So whether you like it or not, it is real. There is increased awareness. And I think, as Tom points out, you sort of have to take into consideration, we've got to work our way through this, and how do we move forward in a prudent and thoughtful manner. So I think it is real.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's interesting. Christian, anything you want to throw in here? I know you and I have had our own conversations about this.
Yeah. Very quickly. So I would say I'm actually really heartened by the evolution. I think it's quite interesting, but I would ask us to be intellectually honest with ourselves, which is there are things that we may deem important that are, as Tom said, sort of material and hence interact with value creation or return generation. And I think there's other things that we might deem are important that are associated with a set of trade-offs that we're going to have to manage. And so I would like us to be just sort of intellectually honest about that and say that, you know, that not everything is free. We're going to have to make some really hard choices about what it is we care about. And then with respect to sort of the Milton Friedman approach, I still think that's a good way to start to think about a problem, actually, and then you can go out from there. But what's interesting here is, you know, however you define it, whether it's very narrow ESG products or much more broadly when we're talking about pensions and endowments and others that are being increasingly asked to internalize ESG considerations, that's maybe tens of trillions of dollars out there. And so the shareholders do now care about this stuff. So that's not inconsistent with Friedman in any way, ultimately, if it's about the shareholders. So this is ongoing. I mean, we've seen it already perhaps reflected in this sort of climate czar position that I think is going to be a cabinet level position, if I understand it, with John Kerry. So there's some interesting developments that are happening, and I'm excited about it, but I think we need to be precise and honest about costs and trade-offs so that we can allocate our scarce resources carefully.
Yep. Okay, so I want to turn to healthcare now. So obviously healthcare has been one of the biggest hot button issues on both sides of the aisle. I would like your opinion on this, but it sort of appears that the Supreme Court's not going to completely overturn all of ACA. And then of course with the COVID situation, just, you know, the healthcare industry has been turned upside down, and, you know, major forces pulling in different directions there. What is the Biden administration going to do? What are they going to want to do? What are they going to be able to do on the healthcare side in both the short run as well as in the long run? And, you know, Mary Moore, what's your take on this?
Let me take a crack at this. I actually staffed healthcare on Capitol Hill back during the Clinton administration. I worked on the Hill on this topic. I think that healthcare is a very, very difficult, challenging, complex problem. And unless you've worked in it, you do not realize the Rubik's Cube that you're really managing. I do think that the political environment it took us 10 years to get here. But when Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act was passed on a party line vote with Democrat control of the government, for 10 years, Democrats didn't want to make one change to it. And for 10 years, Republicans only wanted to rip it out and replace it. So I think people finally realized, you know, the system has been in place for 10 years and we really need to fix it. The bill didn't even go to conference when it was passed originally. And I think we've seen momentum and recognition that we really do need to fix the problems in the system. That being said, I think it's challenging because it is very complicated. But I do think that the political backdrop, we finally reached a point where there will be an appetite for it just because it is so critical and we see the problems in the healthcare system.
Mm-hmm. Tom, you have thoughts you want to?
No, I think, you know, Mary Moore is right. You know, this is a classic example of if you pass major legislation on a party line vote, you know, it's just going to become a political hot potato. I think the challenge that the Republicans have had, they don't have an alternative. You know, this many years in. You know, President-elect Biden has not made any bones about the fact that he wants to strengthen the ACA. I think there will be efforts made there, probably through the regulatory process. their OMB nomination and as well as some of the other nominations are clearly showing that the Biden administration will be much more reliant on the regulatory process to get certain things done. I think healthcare will be a part of that. And I don't, we shouldn't underestimate either the anxieties and concerns of some people regarding their healthcare, particularly while we are in a down economic cycle as well. So more to be seen there, but as Mary Moore said, we're now 10 plus years in. We need to get away from this. Is the ACA going to be here or not debate? It is going to be here, but it's how can we maybe improve it and make it better? And that's where I think we should be going.
Mm-hmm. Right. Chris, anything you want to add to that?
No, I find this topic extremely vexing.
Okay, so it was brought up a couple of times that everybody can agree on trade has changed and the relationship with China has changed. It sort of seems like everybody agrees that infrastructure spending is needed in the U.S. That we have a crumbling infrastructure, or at least a need for more investment. I think that you hear this from Republicans, you hear it from Democrats. Yet, there was sort of weak attempts to actually have anything happen on the infrastructure side. To me, it feels like there'd be a great opportunity here as we're thinking about things on the fiscal stimulus side. If we're going to be needing to provide fiscal stimulus, there's lots of things on the infrastructure side. We brought up, broadband is one possibility. What are the chances of getting sort of a real large scale infrastructure plan through Congress and as part of a stimulus plan?
I'll take the first crack at that. I think there are some good chances of that happening, even though there was a reluctance by Democrats in Congress not to give the Trump administration a win on this. There had been significant talks around this. I do think the economic situation is going to dictate some of that, because the fiscal stimulus that you use for an infrastructure package, it's going to have a multiplier effect to it, right? It's not we're just giving money, we're just helicoptering money out there. It's actually going to have a purpose. It's going to help drive growth. It's going to help create jobs. The other, and this is something that we've been advocating for as well, and Greg, you were touching on it also. We need to think about infrastructure more broadly. I mean, generally, when people talk about infrastructure, it's all right. It's road building and maybe ports and whatever, airports, and the use of the gas tax to do that, whatever. 5G is an infrastructure issue, right? 5G deployment. We can't start to solve certain things like the homework gap unless you have appropriate 5G deployment, et cetera. And that's just one example. Another example, believe it or not, and this was uncovered during the pandemic, government IT is so antiquated, it is not funny. One of the things you'll see coming out of this, and I would actually argue to some degree, it could be part of an infrastructure package. We need government IT modernization on all levels of government, because we have a system that's still incredibly paper-based. So there are certain efficiencies we could build in there too. So I'm actually pretty bullish and hopeful that that's going to be one of the things we can get done.
I'd like to build on what Tom said. He's absolutely right about the government IT structure. And you've certainly heard President-elect Biden talk about wanting to start with government buildings, bringing them up to speed, government vehicles. I don't know that everybody's going to be driving, an electric vehicle, but I think you'll see at the margins, the government will move forward. I think the government is behind the private sector, frankly, in many areas of modernization and climate change, just because of lack of funds. And so I do think that 5G is a really critical opportunity. And if we're smart about it and we're going to spend more money, let's try to think about how do we get doubles and triples, so that we're not only, we're improving our cyber security situation from a foreign national security, but we're also improving things for efficiency, climate operations, let's think holistically, let's think targeted. Maybe it starts as smaller projects and then it becomes, bigger. But I do think that we have an opportunity here.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would just add one additional thing, which is the multiplier argument. I think is correct that Tom alluded to. So basically, you get sort of a significant uptake, increase in the economic impact as a result of any dollars that's spent. But it is sort of medium to long run where that starts to bear fruit. So my view is this is almost like analogous to sort of the private sector and capital expenditure. It's an important expenditure, but it has significant returns that manifest down the road. So it's not going to fix the here and now in terms of our struggling economic activity. Maybe it offers some jobs or something, but ultimately the biggest bang for the buck is down the road. This is what a government is supposed to do, however. So it's really important. And I do think there has been some, at least rhetoric consensus among the different parties on doing this. The fact that it hasn't come to pass is a reflection of the divided nature of our government, I think. So to where we started and Mary Moore's very first point, which is maybe we can finally start getting some stuff done in Washington. If anything, I suspect, after COVID stimulus, it would be here because this is where there is a fair amount of agreement.
Great. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. I think this might be something else that Republicans and Democrats agree on, but big tech has become a problem. Is that true? I mean, certainly they've come in the crosshairs, and again, it's hard for me to know how much of this is rhetoric, how much of it is real. What are the real policy differences that might happen with the Biden administration and stuff? So I'm really curious. What's big tech in for the next few years?
I tell you, big tech and China are the two areas that you're going to have Republican and Democratic agreement on. So I think I would be staffing up if I were at big tech. Tom, you've seen it more directly. I think there was something passed just recently on big tech, and you have President Trump holding up the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, because he wants to remove the liability protections, I believe, that big tech has. That happened in a tweet, I think, as recently as last night. And so the whole funding of our defense is on hold until we resolve that big tech issue. But Tom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think big tech unites, but Democrats and Republicans are coming at this for completely different reasons. One is you are seeing, Democrats have concerns about tech being too big, being too, having such a stranglehold, with some people. You have Republicans looking at it, being very concerned, where they think that there's a bias against conservatives with tech companies. So, what Mary Moore was talking about was the 230 liability protections. That is where you're really seeing that first wave, coming at it. Second is antitrust, where you have, again, Democrats and Republicans for different reasons are looking to use antitrust tools, sometimes in some, new and unique ways. New York is actually looking to pass an antitrust law that is much similar to, let's say, the EU's approach to antitrust and the traditional US model, but we're going to start to see those tools used as well. But one of the interesting things around that is that antitrust debate, it's really a debate about privacy, right? So again, you sort of get back to whether or not Washington is working. We have not come up with a national policy around data privacy. Is one, one observer this has talked about. Privacy is an asset that people hold, yet they've given it away in a deal where they give it away for free. We haven't resolved what our societal concerns are, what our societal expectations are around privacy, but that's really what you're seeing play out in the antitrust debate. So the thing I would say with tech is you have to sort of take a look at, peel the onion back a little bit, and really see what is at the core of the arguments that are being made on both sides to get a better understanding of what the true concerns are.
Great. Well, I know we're right at time now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. But I want to thank you once more. Thanks to our panelists for sharing their expert insights, and also thanks to our attendees for engaging with us today and asking such thought-provoking questions through the chat. If you'd like to learn more about the topics we discussed today or connect with any of our experts, I invite you to visit our website, kenaninstitute.unc.edu, for additional research and resources. And there you can also find a list of our other upcoming webinars and virtual events. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to host you again soon.